John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, the Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 127, and this is the penultimate issue of the Paul Jenkins run. So I'm very excited to get this wrapped up and put a bow on this run, which I thought was pretty dang good. And then Garth Ennis returns for a short story arc of 6 issues, and then we have the Warren Ellis run, which I haven't read, but I've heard is good stuff. And before we get into this issue, just a little catch-up. In the last couple issues, we saw all of John's friends leave him, and we also saw Danny, his girlfriend, leave him. And this was all due to the demoness Chantanelli. She is working behind the scenes trying to ruin John's life. And the way she's doing this is she's influencing a guy named Gavin that used to kind of be around John's friend circle, and she's making him believe that John had some part in his girlfriend's death. And Chantanelli is coming to him as an apparition of his girlfriend, so he thinks he's talking to a ghost, but it's actually just Chantanelli. I'm not sure if she's actually there in person or if she's just a projection, but for sure she did show up at the end of the last issue when she made it look like John had slept around on Danny as Danny came home from work one day and caught a naked John in bed sleeping, and behind him was a naked woman, and that woman was Chantanelli. So John's life is completely ruined at the moment. All of his friends are gone. Danny left him, and that is where we left off on the last issue. So first things first, with issue 127, we got the cover. We see the first of the Fallen. He's looking at us very angry. He's got a snarl on his face, and we can see his sharp teeth. And he's got a trench coat on, it looks like, but it's so small on him that his giant muscular arms that he's flexing kind of make it look like he's wearing spandex around them. And we can't really see much of the background. It looks like there's some energy waves and some children's faces in this vortex of energy. But everything's pretty wobbly, so you can't really see too much. And also on the cover, we can see that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Warren Pleece. And as we turn to the first page, we see John is walking down the street, and it seems like he's looking for some sort of shop or place. And as he does that, he's holding the card that says FOTF on the top that the First of the Fallen gave him at the end of the last arc. So it seems John is looking for the First of the Fallen. So as he searches this area, his narration says, "It may not surprise you to learn that I consider myself an expert on failure. Failure is when you tumble, frightened and alone, into a sea of confusion. It's when you struggle to survive, refusing to be lost in the detritus. It's when you catch a glimpse of daylight above and struggle towards it, only to be swallowed by a shark." Then we cut to a flashback of John sitting on his bed by the phone, and it seems like he's trying to figure out what to do, and he's thinking about his friend Muppet, who's in the hospital, and all his other friends that have left him, and also Danny, of course, who just left him. And over these panels, the narration says, "Nowadays, I'm every shark's best chum. If you don't believe me, ask anyone. You could ask my mates, for instance, assuming there were any left to ask. Or my girlfriend, assuming you could catch up with her. Yeah, it's a soggy little dilemma. I'm thrashing and bleeding in the water, with a school of angry predators closing in fast. As I see it, there's only one way out of the whole mess. Sink." Then we see John reach in his pocket and pull out the business card of the First of the Fallen and dial the number. And then we see the First of the Fallen pick up his cell phone and answer, and we see behind him there's a sign that says FOTF Enterprises, so he seems to be a businessman of some kind now. And he says to John, "Hello, Constantine. I've been expecting your call, of course." "What? Oh, no, nothing like that. Now, there's no need for profanity. I assure you, I had nothing to do with it." Then we cut to John's side of that conversation, and he's saying, "I'll bet you didn't, you wanker. You knew this was going to happen all along. Christ, I don't even know why I called." And the first replies, "Because you have no choice. Oh, look, why don't you come by and see me in person, and we'll get this all sorted out. It'll be very quick and painless, I promise. I'm on Romford High Street." And John says, "Why isn't that a surprise?" "All right, where exactly?" And the first says, "Oh, you'll know when you see it." Then we cut back to present away from that flashback, and John has stopped in front of some stairs that go down to a basement area, it looks, in the middle of these shops. So it stands out because there's like a washer dryer store and then an auto glass store. And in between those two, there's just a little doorway cut in that says FOTO Enterprises, George Spigot, proprietor. And then there's a man who looks like a skinhead that is standing off to the side, and he's eyeing John and smoking a cigarette. And as John turns to go down the stairs, he looks at the skinhead and says, "Hello, Anger." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is How to Play with Fire Part 3, Burning Down the House. Then we turn the page, and we cut to Gavin sitting in the room he's always in, and he's looking pretty happy because he's smiling to himself, and he's speaking to Chantinelli standing behind him. And he's saying, "We've done it. We've utterly destroyed him, Pam, and you never saw it coming." And Pam, who's got a very sour look on her face, says, "You pathetic little bastard." And this confuses Gavin, so he turns around and says, "What?" And then she turns away from him and says, "Oh, Gavin, how could you allow yourself to be so consumed by self-pity and denial?" And Gavin says, "Denial? I don't understand." And then Pam turns to him and says, "Yes, you do. You may well try to fool yourself, Gavin, but you can't fool me. I was there, remember? I know what you did." So it seems like now that Chantinelli has achieved her goal of fucking with Constantine's life, she now has no use for Gavin, so she's turning on him and making him feel pathetic. Or maybe this is actually what really happened, I'm not sure, because she has shown so many different versions of what happened in the bar that night that Pam died. So we get yet another rendition of what happened, and we cut to a flashback in the bar where we see Gavin is jealously watching Pam talk to Constantine. And over these panels, Chantinelli narrates, "Let's be honest. You and I weren't exactly blazing a trail, were we? I was so bored and unhappy, and you'd just sit on your thumbs all day and night, buried in those stupid books, all because you wanted to be a player on the magical scene. But it was more than that, wasn't it? You wanted to be better than everyone else." Then we see Gavin with Pam and John and Chaz in the bar, and Gavin says to John, "So I was wondering, Connors, if you had a chance to ask Archie Fane about that McAdams book. You know, the one with the terror magic." And then John, who looks over to Pam and puts an arm around her, says, "Yeah, Gav, listen, let's give the bloody netherworld a rest tonight, eh? I think your better half's about to get drastic, aren't you, love?" And it looks like Pam might be blushing from that, and she laughs a little bit. Then we get to Gavin standing next to her, whose eyes are very wide and he looks very angry. And over this, Pam/Chantinelli's narration says, "God, you were almost pathetic, just because you thought you'd been slighted by someone better than you. Even worse, because he was right." Then we cut back to present, where Pam is staring right into Gavin's face, and he's looking into her eyes, and she says, "Poor John. He was just trying to be funny, Gavin. But you made him the scapegoat for your inadequacy. By the time we got into the car, you'd convinced yourself that John and I were somehow fucking each other on the side. You were so angry, you drove into the back of a council van just to prove some demented point or other." Then Pam stands up tall in front of Gavin and cups her breast through her shirt with her hands. And she continues saying, "Take a long, hard look. They're just knots of glandular tissue and fat. Yet to you, they're everything. Touch them properly, and I'm under your spell. Isn't that how it works? You never loved me. I was never your partner. I was your territory, and you pissed on me good and proper." And then she turns away from him and walks out of the room, and as she does, she says, "You could never ascertain the extent of your control, so you killed me instead. And now you've gone and ruined the life of the one person who at least made an effort to care. I don't know how you can live with yourself." And then she walks out of the room. Then we turn the page and we cut to John, and he is sitting in the First of the Fallen's office, and he even has a cup of tea in his hand, so it seems like he's made himself comfortable in this odd situation. And John says to the First, I see you found yourself a sense of humor then. And the first leans back and puts his feet up on the desk and says to John, well, life's bloody funny, isn't it, John? I mean, look at the way it twists and turns. Not that you need reminding of that. But do you know what makes me chuckle? Sheer bloody desperation. That's what. For example, then we cut away to a panel of John's friend Weeble running through the park, and he's all green and he's trailing some kind of smoke behind him, so he is still possessed by Buer and Alistair. And the first of the Fallen says, take Buer and Crowley, for example. In order to sustain their rather clumsy attempt at world domination, they've taken up residence inside your chubby pal Weeble. They've got him drinking carrot juice and doing laps around Tooting Beck Common just to get his blood pressure down below 12 million. It's bloody priceless, John, like a scene from the Keystone Cops. If only you could see it. But when the first looks down to see if John is enjoying this story, he sees John has his head in his hands, and this gives the first pause, and he says, yes, well, if only you could. And then he stands up and he says, anyway, I suppose you think this is going to be some kind of showdown between us, but you're going to be very disappointed, I'm afraid. All I ask is that you listen for a couple minutes and then decide. It might even do you some good. The problem with the wages of sin, Constantine, is that they're awfully low. Not even enough to pay the rent on hell, really. The most I've been able to ask for is a little job satisfaction, a sense of achievement now and then. And recently, you've been the only one to give it to me. I've hated you for it, of course, especially the little bit about having to be mortal. But if there's one thing I hate, it's Greeks. But you know, hindsight brings about clarity and perception. And let's face it, you've been responsible for getting my creative juices flowing again. And then he walks from behind his desk over to John and puts a hand on John's shoulder and says, I've begun to realize how alike we are in so many respects. And don't look at me sideways. You know it's true. We're both firm in our beliefs, even if we're never quite sure what they are. Neither of us will suffer fools, gladly or otherwise. And most important, we're at our best when we are truly alone. And at that, John looks up at him, and the first reaches behind him and pulls out a contract, and he says, but to business. I know you want things back the way they were, and I can make that happen. The price is high, but so are the stakes, and that's what makes it fun. And as John takes the contract, he hands John a pen, and he says, for old time's sake, you know the score. And then John leans forward and puts the pages on his desk, and he begins to look it over to sign, and the first kind of points to some jargon on the page and says, by the way, there's an additional clause in here pertaining to that spiffy little demoness who knifed me in the back. You can see it as a 2-for-1 sort of deal. Oh, and if you need to add anything, feel free. And I don't know about you guys, but this really feels like a banker or some sort of like timeshare thing that John is being pressured into. So it's a very interesting environment for the First of the Fallen to be working in. And at first, John just kind of hesitates as he looks down at the document, but then he puts pen to paper, and as he signs, he says, only if it'll get you to stop talking like a pillock. And as the first quickly grabs up the contract pages, John asks, so, where is he? And the first, with a big smile on his face, says, you've already met him, as a matter of fact. A couple of years ago, out in the forest near Borley Rectory. He was calling himself Tom at that time. I can't go with you, of course. It wouldn't look very good for a start. But since you're going anyway, perhaps you could do me a little favor. And then the first picks up a letter and hands it to John and says, when you get there, I want you to give him this. And as John takes the letter in his hands, he asks, what does it say? And the first answers, nothing much. And then John flips the envelope over to the front, and it says, to Dad. So apparently John just signed whatever contract that was so that he could get the location of where God is. I guess so he could talk to him for some reason. We don't really know why. And also apparently sometime during the Paul Jenkins runs over the last couple of years, John actually met this man named Tom, who was actually God. But of course then he did not know it. Then we cut back to Gavin in his room alone, And this is actually the moment that we started at the beginning of this whole Gavin and Pam storyline, where Gavin is sitting in his room, repeatedly listening to the message on his message machine, which is Pam saying, "Hi, you've reached the answering thingy of Pam and Gavin. We're not around to take your call right now. Stop it, Gav. So leave a message." And as it's playing and Gavin's listening to it, we hear a clicking noise, and then we also see what Gavin is seeing in his head, and he's seeing flashes of Pam and John having sex. And as the message repeats one last time, if you remember, that clicking that was going on was the sound of the hammer pulling back on a revolver, and he has it to his head, and he pulls the trigger, and very graphically, he shoots himself in the head. And then his body is just left slumped in the chair while the message machine continues to play. And I guess Gavin must have been pushing like rewind every time it got to the end of that, because now that he can't do that, it continues playing, and we hear the message that was left after that beep. And it's John, and he's saying, "Oi, Gav, it's John Constantine. You owe me a pint, mate, because I found that McAdam books you were after. Tell you what, I'll meet you down at the King's Head." Then we turn the page, and we cut to Ellie in her cave hiding in hell. And she's just sitting there alone as always. And as she stares into the flames surrounding her, the narration says, "What are little girls made of? Of venom and witch piss and everything foul imaginable." And as Shantanelli is looking into the flames, someone calls behind her, "Shantanelli?" And as she turns, she sees the angel who she was in love with. I can't remember his name at the moment, but it's from the Garth Ennis run. If you remember that storyline, Shantanelli and him were in love and were lovers, and she had gotten pregnant from him, and they had gone to John for help so that he would hide them from hell. But unfortunately, they did not think about hiding from heaven, so angels ended up coming down and killing her child and taking her boyfriend back to heaven. So she has not seen him since then, so she's very surprised when she turns around and sees him, and he says, "My love." And she immediately gets up and runs to him saying, "No, it can't be you. You were gone. They took you away. How did you get back?" And as she reaches him, he says, "For that, you may thank the mortal Constantine. His was the concern that brought me here, to rectify his mistake. You have wronged him, demoness." And then she embraces him close, resting her face on his chest and closing her eyes as she says, I didn't mean to. I'll undo any damage, if that's what your wish is, my love. His suffering no longer matters. All that matters is that you've come back. I don't have to be afraid anymore." But as she says that, the panel pulls out and we get to see more around her, and she is embracing the First of the Fallen now, not her long-lost angel lover. And the First of the Fallen smiles and says to her, saying that she doesn't have to be afraid anymore, "Oh, I wouldn't say that." And she immediately tries to run away, but he has grabbed her arm, and she says, "My lord, I cannot say what it means that you're here. Ah!" And then he pulls her close to his face and says, "I'm sure you can't, you nefarious little meretrix. So I'll tell you, shall I?" And as he says this last line, he grabs her by the face, and he shoves his pointer and middle fingers into her eye sockets, kind of like he's grabbing a bowling ball, and he continues saying, "It means that I know those diseased, spunk-stained fingers were wrapped around the knife that sent me away. It means that you can never trust an evil fucker like Constantine to keep any of your naughty secrets." And then he picks her up by the head with his fingers still in her eye sockets, and he holds her out over the abyss of flames, and he says, "It means you're going to find out about eternity." And as she dangles over the flames of the abyss, we see a giant mouth or orifice open up, and it's got long, sharp teeth that begin gnashing. And he drops her, but grabs her by the arm before she can fall more, and she screams at this, and he says, "Try to keep it down. There's a good girl. I can't abide all that bloody carrying on. Besides, you'll be better off preserving that energy in the long run. I can assure you of that." And then he lets her go, and as she falls into the mouth, it begins chomping and slowly eating her, and she's still trying to plead, saying, You mustn't believe Constantine, Lord. He lies." And the first, watching her with no emotion on his face, says, Yes, but he made an exception in your case. He says hello, by the way." And as the mouth is about to fully consume her, we hear from inside its blackness, "No, he can't do this. The rules." And then the first turns as the mouth disappears, and he wipes his hands together to try to get some of that eyeball juice off. And he nonchalantly says about the rules, "He changed them." Then we turn the page, and we cut to John in Chaz's cab, and Chaz is giving him a ride. And he's saying to John, "Fucking hell, Constantine. Why couldn't you get one of your other mates to drive you?" And as John lights a cigarette, he says, "'Cause you're the only one left, Chaz." And Chaz replies, "Yeah, well, I've got a real bloody life, in case you didn't notice. I can't just go gallivanting about the country anymore. Not 'cause of Renee, not 'cause of the kid or the baby. Just 'cause I've done my time, and I don't want any more, all right? It's all over, John. Do you hear me? It's got to end." And then John takes a drag of his cigarette and says, "Be careful what you wish for, mate." Then we see the cab stop, and John gets out, and Chaz also gets out, and as he leans against his car, he asks John, "What now?" And John answers, "Wait here." And this, of course, pisses Chaz off, because like he said, he was in the middle of doing something. So he says, "Wait here? Who the fuck do you think you're talking to, man? I ain't your bloody slave." And then John gets very serious and snaps back, "Yes, you are, you bloody flathead. You're my slave for as long as you bloody owe me. Why? Because you can't start and help yourself. See, the difference between you and me, Chaz, is that even though I can't drive, I'm going somewhere. But you know what happens to you? Absolutely sweet fuck all." And at that, Chaz punches John in the stomach and yells, "Bastard!" And then he grabs John by the hair and starts pulling him, and he says, "You fucking snotty, self-centered little bastard." And he pulls him over to a wooden fence on the side of the road, and he smashes John's head into it, and he says, "You think you're fucking clever, do you? Well, I'll tell you something, chum. You may be the genius, and I may be the fuckwit, but I'm not the one stranded 50 miles from home, am I?" And then he walks off, and he gets into his cab, and just before he shuts the door, John gets one more sarcastic jab in, saying, "I take it, no more free rides then, Chaz." Then we turn the page, and we're back to the actual present of John sitting by this fire, where he's been recounting all of the events that took place over the last 3 issues. And originally, it looked like he was just talking to us and breaking the fourth wall, but now we can see that there's a second person sitting next to him on a tree stump. And we have seen this man before. This is that old man Tom that John met in the woods. I believe it's issue 97, where John was called to the woods for some reason. I can't remember exactly why. But he met this old man in the woods who had some tarot cards, and John kept pulling the fox card while they were talking. But we know now, of course, that Tom was not just an old man in the woods. He was actually God. And as John finishes telling him his story, he says, "All of which got me here with you. It's funny, really. I should have known who you were the first time I met you. I mean, the bit about you being a shepherd was a dead giveaway. So the big question is, Tom, what do you make of all that?" And Tom answers, "I feel your pain, John Constantine, but what am I to do for you?" And John snaps back, "Feel my bloody pain? What, they give you an amateur fucking psychology course as part of the training, do they? All right then. Stop me if you've heard this one, mind. Why do bad things happen to good people?" And then Tom, who is God, begins to illuminate, and he turns completely white as he looks John in the eyes and says, "Touché." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So next time we will get the conclusion of the Paul Jenkins run and this story arc, and I am very excited to see how this ends and where John will go from the Paul Jenkins run. But we'll have to wait until next time for that. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.